is a picture of Jim Morrison at dark. Very dark? Because he did have a dark side now, alive in acrylic. It's very bright fellow, UCLA student Jim Morrison. They formed the Doors. They went on to create some of the most distinctive and successful albums and rock music at 85. Rock legend Grace Slick is breaking her silence. And what she's revealing about Jim Morrison is causing a stir in the music world. Jim Morrison is the poster child for 60s rocker musician for decades. Fans only saw the Doors' wild, poetic frontman. But behind the fame was a darker, more chaotic side that only a few truly witnessed. Slick says she saw it all, and now she's telling everything. What secrets has she kept hidden all these years? And why is she choosing to speak? Now join us as we dive into the untold truths and legendary chaos of the rock and roll era. Jim Morrison's wildest moments, Grace Slick of Jefferson Airplane, turned 85 in 2024, and she's still sharing stories from her rock and roll days. One of the most interesting things she's talked about lately is her time with Jim Morrison. From the Doors, they met in the late 1960s, when rock music was changing everything. Slick's stories give everyone a new look at the psychedelic rock scene and show things people didn't know before her first-hand accounts. Help everyone better understand how these famous musicians created their art. Grace Slick, of course, she is touring here in Austin tonight. Sort of. Anyway, the Woodstock. Rocker now does her art on canvas instead of on stage during such an experimental time. In music history in the late 60s, Europe witnessed a tour like no other. Jefferson Airplane and the Doors, two of the most talked about bands from the United States, joined forces for a string of high-energy shows across the continent. The crowds were massive, and the shows were electric. Grace Slick, already known for her bold stage presence, and unforgettable tracks like White Rabbit was a star in her own right. Jim Morrison, with his mysterious charm and deep, often haunting lyrics, brought his storm to the stage. Grace Slick's most surprising encounter with Jim Morrison didn't happen under stage lights or in front of cheering fans. It occurred in a motel hallway. The year was 1967, after a gig in West Hollywood. Grace and her bandmate, Paul Kantner, were heading back to their rooms at the Tropicana Motel as they walked through the corridor. They were met with an unexpected sight. Jim Morrison, downright indecent, crawling on his hands and knees, making loud barking sounds. He wasn't pretending he was entirely lost in the moment, tripping on substance overuse. Paul didn't even pause. He just stepped over Jim and kept walking, like it was something he'd seen before. But Grace froze. She couldn't believe what she was looking at. It was strange, chaotic, and a little bit hilarious. Even though it was a shocking moment, it stuck with her, not just because it was bizarre, but because it captured something real about Jim. He lived without limits, constantly drifting between genius and madness, and never caring what anyone thought. How does one walk away from someone like that without feeling like they have brushed against something wild and unforgettable? Wild nights and bitter ends. Spending time with Jim Morrison was like walking into a different world every day. Something about him drew people in his intense stare. The way he carried himself, always dressed like he didn't care, but somehow made everyone else care. A little more. Jim Morrison is one of rock music's kind of darker heroes, and when the Doors started having some mainstream success, you could tell it made him uncomfortable. Grace Slick was no exception. She understood the pull because she felt it too. Jim had that rare mix of beauty and danger that could stop a room. Yet behind all that charm was someone who seemed to drift further from reality with each passing night, she mentioned. that it wasn't easy to hold a conversation with him one moment. He'd be sitting beside you, and the next, it was like he'd disappeared inside his own head. He was often under the influence, and was sometimes completely unreachable. She, however, was no stranger to the scene herself. The late 60s were wild, and she had her own moments of excess. But Jim lived like he had nothing to lose. His need to escape. Reality seemed stronger than anyone around him. One night in London, staying at the Belgravia Hotel, Grace decided to follow the pull she'd been feeling. They were staying at the Belgravia Hotel, and late one night she made her way to his room. Jefferson Airplane had a playful knock they all used to signal each other. Grace tapped it out on his door, even though Jim wouldn't recognize it. Still, he opened up with that crooked smile of his, like he was already in on the joke. What happened inside wasn't what most would expect from two rock legends. Grace remembered it, clearly not because of the passion alone, but because of how different it felt. She said being with Jim was like connecting with something beautiful and out of reach, as if he wasn't really human. More like some untamed piece of art. With a heartbeat, she didn't pretend. Otherwise, she mentioned she had fun, and she wasn't embarrassed to admit it. That night wasn't just about desire. It left behind a strange kind of ache, the kind of person would feel when something meaningful ends before it even begins. Could a moment that intense really mean nothing? Jim Morrison, a storm too wild by morning, the magic of the night before, had started to fade. As Grace walked out of Jim's hotel room, she left behind a light-hearted message. He could reach out if he felt like it, but the phone never rang. Not that day, not later. He simply disappeared back into his world, like nothing had happened. Grace would joke about it years later, calling herself forgettable, but behind the laughter was a small trace of hurt. She hadn't expected a romance yet. Something in that night had stirred her. It was brief, maybe fleeting, but it felt real in the moment. Amsterdam brought one of the strangest moments Grace ever shared with Jim. The band had scored a pressed form of potent herbal material, something most people would save for later, but not Jim. He sat right down on the curb, broke off a large piece, and ate it like candy fans had already handed him other substances, whatever was going around, and he mixed it all without a second thought that night. As Jefferson Airplane lit up the stage, Jim reappeared out of nowhere, stumbling into the spotlight and wrapping his arms around Grace, mid-performance. But that dreamy moment fell apart as quickly as it began. Jim drifted off stage, wandered back to the dressing room, and passed out cold. Grace laughed it off at the time, but inside she knew what it meant. He was spiraling. So when news broke in 1971 that Jim had passed away in a Paris apartment at just 27, the Doors lead singer Jim Morrison died in Paris, France, nearly 54 years ago, at the age of 27. But one fan thinks that counterculture icon is alive and well in Syracuse, New York. It didn't surprise her. She'd seen the cracks forming long before the end came. Losing him felt heavier than she expected, not just because of who he was, but because it marked the fading of an era. Grace Slick once described Jim Morrison as a human experiment, constantly pushing the limits of what the body and mind could endure. She wasn't shy about her use of substances, but it was her choice, and she didn't make a habit of it. She wrote White Rabbit, a song that became a symbol of the psychedelic era. But unlike Jim, she had boundaries. He would take anything, anywhere, without hesitation. Grace believed her own trips were manageable because she didn't carry the same shadows Jim seemed to wrestle with even after all the years and distance. Something about Jim lingered in her mind. Unshaped, unresolved, impossible to forget was her art. A way of finishing the conversation. He walked away from brushstrokes of chaos many years later, after Grace stopped using mind-bending substances. And in the early 1990s, she found a new way to express herself through painting without planning it. Jim Morrison started showing up in her artwork. In one painting, she showed him with no shirt on, standing with his arms wide open like some kind of rock legend in another called Pretty Boy. She focused on his sharp face, and the sadness in his eyes. She mentioned that the paintings were not made out of anger or regret. She also mentioned that she liked Jim. He was good-looking, but also deeply troubled. Her art was just a way of remembering someone she could never really forget. Even now at 85, the memory of that one wild night still sparks something in Grace. A mix of mischief and nostalgia that reveals who they truly were. It wasn't a great love story, but it was one that has haunted her Jefferson airplane, and the Doors did more than just play music. They stood for a generation that wanted to break the rules. Their songs spoke to young people who were tired of war, tired of being told what to do, and just wanted to feel free. Grace Slick and Jim Morrison were right in the middle of all that. Grace once joked about putting chemical substances in President Nixon's tea. And Jim got arrested for doing something crazy on stage. They didn't try to set a good example. They were wild, loud, and proud of it. Grace's journey did not stop after the 1960s. She kept making music first, with Jefferson Airplane, then with Jefferson Starship, and even into the 1980s with big hits, like We Built This City, which she later said she disliked. She eventually stopped making unhealthy choices, but her strong spirit stayed. She just found new ways to express it. By the time she left the music scene, she had seen almost everything that fame could bring, both the good and the bad. Even as Grace moved forward, leaving behind the chaos of the 60s, the memories of that wild time stayed with her. Could someone who lived through such an intense, unforgettable era ever truly leave it behind? And what about Jim Morrison made him so unforgettable? Spirits on the Highway. Jim Morrison was born on December 8th, 1943, in the quiet town of Melbourne, Florida. His mother, Clara Virginia, and his father, George Stephen Morrison, were raising a family shaped by military life. George would go on to become a rear admiral in the U.S. Navy. Jim's family background included Irish, Scottish, and English heritage. In 1964, his father played a significant role in the Gulf of Tonkin incident. How do you start a war? Simple, blame it on the other guy. That's essentially what the Gulf of Tonkin resolution did for the United States in Vietnam. A turning point that escalated America's involvement in the Vietnam War. Jim grew up with two younger siblings, Anne, born in 1947 in New Mexico, and Andrew, who arrived the following year in California. One story about Jim keeps coming back when people discuss his childhood, when he was about 4. His family was driving through the desert and passed a serious car crash. Jim said he saw injured Native Americans on the road. This sight stayed with him forever. He didn't just remember it. He put it into his songs and poems like Peace Frog Dawn's Highway and Ghost Song. Jim felt that moment changed him completely, as if those spirits he witnessed had somehow become part of who he was. But Jim's family tells a different story. His father confirmed in a biography that they did pass an accident on a reservation, and Jim was upset by it. But he didn't remember anything as dramatic as what Jim later described. Even Jim's sister questioned the story, saying she wasn't sure they had seen anyone passed out on the road at all. The way Jim told it, with Native Americans hurting badly across the highway, It was much more intense than what anyone else in his family remembered seeing. Whether the story was completely true or not, it became an important part of Jim's identity. He carried this memory with him, turned it into poetry, and let it shape who he was. It wasn't just about the facts anymore. It was about how it made him feel and how it influenced him. This blending of reality and emotion left its mark on both his music and the mysterious persona he created. That memory, real or not, gave people a glimpse into how Jim saw the world, through feeling, not just fact. Could that be why his words still feel so haunting? They blurred the line between what happened and what it meant to him, the mind behind the madness. Jim Morrison wasn't just a wild rock star. He was a serious reader and thinker. His high school English teacher once said that Jim read more than anyone else in class, but his book choices were so unusual that they seemed made up. He talked about Old English books on topics like demonology from the 1500s and 1600s. The teacher was so doubtful that he asked someone visiting the Library of Congress to check if these books even existed. They did. Not only were the books real, but Jim's writing showed he had actually read and understood them, even as a teenager. His curiosity led him into strange and dark subjects that most people never explored. After high school, Jim moved in with his grandparents in Clearwater, Florida, and enrolled at St. Petersburg Junior College in 1962. He transferred to Florida State University in Tallahassee, where he even appeared in a school recruitment film, but college life didn't tame him. A year later, he got arrested at a football game for being drunk and causing trouble. That moment gave an early glimpse of the wild spirit he would later become known. For Morrison never stopped loving books. He read constantly, especially works by philosophers, poets, and writers who tackled life's big questions. He was particularly drawn to Friedrich Nietzsche, whose ideas about art freedom and human nature shaped how Jim viewed the world. French poet Arthur Rimbaud influenced the style of his short prose poems. Other favorites included Plutarch's Parallel Lives and American beat writers like Jack Kerouac and William Burroughs. Jim didn't just read for entertainment. He absorbed these ideas and worked them into his lyrics and interviews. Jim was shaped by many thinkers, including Franz Kafka, Albert Camus, Charles Baudelaire, Allen Ginsberg, Vladimir Nabokov, and others. Most of these writers explored rebellion, mystery, and inner struggles just like Jim did. His music wasn't just about rhythm and breaking rules. It carried everything he had, read, thought about, and experienced. Behind his wild image was a mind that never stopped searching for deeper meaning. Could a rooftop poet with a mind full of Camus and chaos have imagined he would soon become the voice of a generation, from rooftop to rock legend? After finishing film school at UCLA in 1965, Jim Morrison lived a simple, free life at Venice Beach, with no job or money. He slept on his friend Dennis Jacobs' rooftop and spent his days writing. During this time, he created Early Doors, songs like Moonlight Drive, and Hello, I Love You, according to Ray Manzarek, his UCLA classmate. Morrison survived mostly on canned beans and substances, fully embracing the creative chaos around him. Ray Manzarek and Jim Morrison first met in film classes, but their real connection happened accidentally. They ran into each other one day on Venice Beach, and Morrison shared some lyrics he'd written. Manzarek was amazed. He thought these words would be perfect for a rock band. They decided to start a group, and soon brought in Robbie Krieger on guitar and John Densmore on drums. While Manzarek, Krieger, and Densmore took meditation classes with the Maharishi, Mahesh Yogi Morrison stayed away from that, focusing instead on his writing and performances. Morrison named the band The Doors. After reading Aldous Huxley's book called The Doors of Perception, which explored how psychedelics could open up human awareness, Huxley got the phrase from poet William Blake, who wrote that if the doors of perception were cleansed, people would see the world as it truly is. Infinite, this idea perfectly matched Morrison's belief about what music and art could do, break through normal limits and connect with something deeper. While Morrison wrote most of the lyrics Robbie Krieger created or helped write, many of their biggest hits, like Light My Fire, Love Me Two Times, and Touch Me. Morrison didn't usually play instruments, but was good at creating vocal melodies for his words. The band would then build songs around these ideas. On stage, Morrison mostly sang and occasionally used tambourine or maracas, though he did play grand piano on Orange County Suite and Moog synthesizer on Strange Days. Together, they created a fresh, bold, and memorable sound, just like Jim himself. Their music made waves, but fame came with a heavy cost, especially for someone like Jim who pushed every boundary. Could a voice that burned so brightly avoid being consumed by its own fire? The Fall of a Firebrand by 1969. Jim Morrison's wild behavior had become truly dangerous during a March concert in Miami. He showed up, drunk, yelled obscenities at the audience, and allegedly made a vulgar challenge that threw the show into chaos. The fallout was fast. 6 arrest warrants came just days later in 1969. The Doors found themselves in a disastrous situation. Their lead singer Jim Morrison had been arrested again and wanted to leave the band, charging him with indecent exposure and other offenses. This scandal forced the Doors to cancel shows and seriously damaged their career momentum. After a lengthy trial, Morrison was found guilty in September 1970. He received a 6-month jail sentence, plus a fine, though he remained free. While appealing the verdict, Morrison later spoke bitterly about his trial experience. He said it destroyed his faith in the justice system, and noted how his money kept him free, while poor defendants he saw in court went straight to jail. Florida officially pardoned Morrison in 10 long after his demise. His bandmates always maintained that he never actually exposed himself during the infamous Miami show. Despite their legal troubles, the Doors kept going. After the soft parade, they made Morrison Hotel, which took them back to their raw rock sound. In late 1970, they started work on L.A. Woman, which would be their last album with Morrison. Their regular producer, Paul Rothchild, quit, so engineer Bruce Botnick stepped in to produce. Instead, Morrison was exhausted and burned out. He told the band he needed to get away to Paris with his girlfriend Pamela Corson. He arrived in spring 1971 and wrote to friends about taking quiet walks and trying to find some peace. He cleaned up his appearance, shaved his beard, and lost weight. He called the band once to check how the album was doing. That was the last time any band member would hear from him on July 3rd. 1971. Pamela found Jim passed away in the bathtub of their Paris apartment. He was just 27 years old. The official cause was listed as heart failure, but no autopsy was performed, since French law didn't require one. According to Pamela, his last words were simply, "Pam, are you still there?" His final days were quiet, almost out of character for someone who once lived so loudly and without restraint. Was his passing the end of the man or the beginning of the myth? He'd spent his whole life creating a restless grave. Rumors spread quickly after the incident. Some said Jim overdosed on some mind-bending substances at a nightclub, and friends brought his body home to avoid a scandal. Mary Unfaithful and others claimed they knew the truth, but no one ever confirmed what really happened. His friend filmmaker, Agnes Varda, later admitted she helped keep the details out of the news. Only 4 people showed up for his burial, and just like that, another rock star was gone too soon. Jim Morrison was buried in Paris at Père Lachaise Cemetery, where famous artists like Oscar Wilde and Edith Piaf are also buried. His grave eventually became one of the cemetery's most visited spots. But it had a rough start for a while. There wasn't even a proper marker. When French officials finally put up a small shield with his name, someone stole it in 1973, making things worse. The cemetery's directory got his name wrong, listing him as Douglas James Morrison instead of James Douglas. Morrison Jim's demise joined those of other stars who passed on at 27. Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, and Brian Jones. This pattern created what people now call the 27 Club, a reminder of the cost of living without limits. Even today, people don't really know what happened in Jim's final hours. What people do know is that he left behind more than just music. He created a legacy of wildness, poetry, and rawness. What do you think about the brief history between Grace Slick and Jim Morrison? Did he really leave behind a legacy, or was his life too short to have created a lasting impression or impact? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy it.